I was the pack's trash, a nameless omega carrying a bastard pup. My alpha mate just humiliated me in front of the entire council to seal a deal with his new bride. He thought I was alone. He didn't realize I wasn't a stray. I was a Vane, and my 3 ruthless brothers just broke down the doors. Welcome to the pack. The Vane brothers have officially arrived, and things are about to get intense. I have a question for the real ones staying until the end. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Globe showing Europe, Africa, drop your flag below. Also, pay close attention to Vespera's eyes in Chapter 3. There's a secret hidden there about her true power. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you believe silence is a predator's biggest mistake. I'll be listening to my favorite comments. The grand obsidian hall of the Silvermoon pack hummed with the predatory energy of 100 wolves, all gathered for the Equinox Gala. Crystal chandeliers, carved from dark quartz, cast a flickering, amber glow over silk tunics and leather furs. Servants, the low-ranked omegas, glided between clusters of high-ranking warriors, bearing silver trays laden with roasted venison and rare mountain wines. Vespera Nyx had positioned herself in the most shadowed corner of the hall, a narrow space behind a massive stone pillar draped in heavy velvet tapestries. From here, she could monitor the room without being drawn into the cruel sport of the younger elites. At 23, Vespera had perfected the art of being a ghost. It wasn't that she was plain. Quite the opposite. Her deep, violet eyes held a haunting intelligence, and her skin had the luster of moonlight. But after she had arrived at the Silvermoon borders 3 years ago, claiming to be a nameless stray, she had learned that beauty was a liability for a girl with no protection. She had traded her pride for safety, accepting the role of a lowly servant to hide from a past that was far more dangerous than any local alpha. She sipped her watered-down wine, allowing herself a small breath of relief. For tonight, she was just another shadow. She had kept her pregnancy hidden beneath the heavy folds of her oversized servant's tunic, her secret heart beating against her own. She was content to be invisible, avoiding the pitying glances or the occasional shove from the beta females who mocked her lowly status. That one, a sharp, baritone voice cut through the air from just behind the tapestry. Vespera froze, the rim of her cup pressing against her lip. "I beg your pardon, Alpha," came a second voice, Beta Marcus, Silas's right-hand man. "The girl by the pillar. The stray you brought in years ago. Who is she truly?" Vespera's heart hammered against her ribs. She considered slipping away into the kitchens, but the tone of the first voice, Alpha Silas, was cold, calculating, and dangerously curious. "That is Vespera, Alpha," Marcus replied. "Nobody. She's been working the kitchens and the laundry. A perfectly obedient worker, though she's had some complications lately." "Complications?" Silas sounded intrigued. "She's carrying Alpha. Most likely some traveler or a low-ranking guard from the summer patrol. She's been out of sight for months, but she cannot hide the swell much longer. She's a blemish on the pack's reputation of purity." "A blemish," Silas repeated, his voice dropping to a silk-wrapped blade. "Tell me, is she desperate for a place to stay? Would she do anything to keep that pup from being tossed into the Frostlands?" Vespera nearly dropped her cup. The audacity. Desperate? "I imagine she's terrified, Alpha. At her rank, she has no rights. She cannot afford to be particular about her future." "Perfect," Silas declared. "Absolutely perfect. A girl with no name and a child to protect is a girl who will sign anything." Before Vespera could process the icy dread pooling in her stomach, Silas swept around the pillar. He was a man of 30, built like a mountain, dressed in midnight blue silks that screamed of his stolen prosperity. He wore an expression of absolute, terrifying determination. "Vespera Nyx," he announced, his voice booming so loudly the music in the hall stuttered to a halt. He didn't wait for her to speak. He grabbed her arm, his fingers bruising her skin, and dragged her toward the center of the obsidian hall. "I know some of you are watching this and thinking, why doesn't she just fight back? I would never let someone treat me like that." It's easy to judge when you've never had to choose between your pride and the life of an innocent child. Vespera is carrying a life that depends entirely on her silence. If you've ever had to swallow your words to protect someone you love, then you know the weight she is carrying. But keep watching, because even the quietest shadows eventually learn how to scream. The grand obsidian hall went silent. The only sound was the crackle of the hearth and the ragged breath of Vespera as Silas shoved her into the center of the moon circle. The aristocratic wolves of Silvermoon leaned forward, their eyes gleaming with the prospect of a public execution or, perhaps worse, a public shaming. "Members of the council," Silas began, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the ancient hall. A hall built back when the pack lived in the ruins of old London, long before the Great Shift. "We are a pack of strength, of lineage. And yet, we have a parasite among us." He pointed a finger at Vespera's protruding belly. A gasp rippled through the room. "This girl, a nameless stray I showed mercy to, has repaid my kindness by bringing a bastard into our midst. She claims the father is unknown, but we all know the truth of her kind. She is a weight around our necks." Vespera looked up, her violet eyes flashing. "You know exactly whose child this is, Silas," she whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a burgeoning volcanic rage. Silas laughed, a sound like grinding stones. He stepped closer, leaning down so only she could hear him. "You are an Omega, Vespera. Your word is dust. Today, you are the sacrifice I need to secure my alliance with the northern borders." He stood tall and addressed the crowd. "I, Alpha Silas, hereby reject this woman. She is not of our blood. She is not of our rank. Guards, strip her of her status and prepare the exile papers. She leaves for the wastelands tonight." The wastelands. It was a death sentence. The frozen ruins of the old world were filled with rogue wolves and silver beasts. The pack began to jeer. Someone threw a piece of fruit that stained Vespera's dress. Another spat at her feet. The betrayal was a physical weight, pressing her down onto the cold stone floor. She felt the baby kick, a sharp, frantic movement, as if the child could feel the hatred of the room. Vespera closed her eyes. She had tried to be the good girl. She had tried to escape the legacy of her brothers, the men who turned battlefields into graveyards. She had wanted a quiet life in this small, historic pack. But Silas had just broken the one rule her family lived by: never corner a vein. She felt the blood howl rising in her throat, a psychic, high-frequency scream unique to her bloodline. It wasn't a sound of pain. It was a beacon. "Silas," she said, her voice suddenly calm, cutting through the noise of the mocking crowd. The room went still. There was something in her tone that made the Alpha's hair stand on end. "You should have checked who my brothers were before you touched me." She tilted her head back and let out a sound that wasn't a wolf's howl, but a piercing, glass-shattering shriek of pure power. The crystal chandeliers overhead exploded, raining shards of glass down like diamonds. The ground beneath the obsidian hall began to vibrate, a rhythmic thumping that sounded like the drums of an approaching army. Silas stepped back, his face paling. What are you doing?" "I'm calling the triad," Vespera whispered, a dark, predatory smile finally touching her lips. "And God help you, Silas, they've always been very protective of their little sister." At that moment, the massive iron-reinforced doors of the hall didn't just open. They were blown off their hinges by a force so violent that the stone walls cracked. A cold, north wind howl tore through the room, and 3 shadows stood silhouetted against the moonlight. As the dust settled and the freezing wind of the northern territories swept in, 3 figures stood silhouetted against the pale moonlight. They didn't look like guests. They looked like the end of the world. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. It's the kind of silence you only find in a room where everyone is suddenly aware they might be breathing their last. It's funny, isn't it? How quickly a crowd turns from predators to prey. You've been sitting there, watching Vespera suffer, perhaps even enjoying the tension while she was being humiliated. Most people just watch. They don't support, they just take the story and leave the storyteller in the cold. But Vespera's brothers? They aren't the type to just watch. They are the type to act. The man in the center stepped forward first. He was tall, dressed in a long, charcoal coat of heavy wool that looked like it belonged in a museum of 19th century nobility. This was Killian Vane, the strategist. His hair was black as a raven's wing, and his eyes, the same haunting violet as Vespera's, scanned the room with a terrifying, clinical detachment. To his left stood Malphas, the executioner. He was broader, his hands encased in leather gloves, a serrated bone dagger visible at his hip. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at the guards, measuring the distance to their throats. To the right was Dante, the youngest, the berserker. He was already half-shifted, his fingernails elongated into claws, a low, tectonic growl vibrating in his chest that made the windows of the hall rattle in their frames. "I believe," Killian said, his voice a smooth, cultured velvet that carried to every corner of the room, "that there has been a misunderstanding." "Silas," recovering his senses but still shaking, stepped forward. "Who are you?" "This is a private pack function. You are trespassing on Silvermoon land." Killian ignored him. His eyes locked onto Vespera, who was still kneeling on the floor, surrounded by glass shards. He saw the torn dress. He saw the bruise on her arm where Silas had gripped her. He saw the swell of her stomach. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Vespera," Killian said softly. "You've stayed away a long time, little sister. We began to think you didn't want to be found." A collective gasp escaped the pack. Little sister? The Omega Stray was a Vane? The realization hit Silas like a physical blow. The Vane triad didn't just rule the North. They were the nightmare stories alphas told their pups to make them behave. They were the descendants of the old kings of the London Underground, a bloodline that hadn't been thinned by peace. "I wanted peace, Killian," Vespera said, her voice finally steady as she stood up, brushing the glass from her skirts. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a queen reclaiming her crown. "But Silas here has decided that I am a parasite. He wants to exile me and your nephew to the wastelands." Dante's growl turned into a roar. He moved so fast the eye could barely follow, a blur of shadow and fur. In a heartbeat, he was across the hall, his hand clamped around the throat of the guard who had thrown fruit at Vespera. With a sickening crack, the guard was tossed aside like a broken doll. "The wastelands?" Malphas asked, stepping into the light, his bone dagger catching the amber glow of the chandeliers. "That's a very harsh sentence for a pregnant woman. I wonder, what is the sentence for an alpha who disrespects the blood of the North?" Silas fell back, his boots skidding on the stone. "I didn't know. She never said. She was a stray. She had no scent, no mark." "She has my scent," Killian whispered, appearing suddenly in front of Silas, his speed supernatural. He leaned in, sniffing the air near Silas's neck. "And right now, all I smell on you is the scent of a dead man walking." The Silvermoon elites, who moments ago were laughing, were now backing away, trying to blend into the shadows. They were realizing that their silence during Vespera's humiliation had made them accomplices. They had watched her fall, and now they were terrified of who might be watching them. Killian turned back to his sister. "What do you want, Vespera? Do we burn this hall to the ground? Or do we take our time?" Vespera looked at Silas, who was now trembling so violently his teeth were chattering. She felt her child kick again. Not a frantic kick this time, but a strong, steady pulse. "The gala isn't over yet, brother," Vespera said, her eyes glowing with a lethal violet light. "I want him to feel exactly what I felt. I want him to understand that in this room, he is the only one who is truly nothing." As Malphas began to walk toward the pack's council, unsheathing his blade with a slow, metallic shing, the doors behind them began to creak. Something else was coming. Something the brothers hadn't brought with them. It's a strange thing, watching someone realize they've made a fatal mistake. You've likely felt it too. That cold prickle down your spine when you realize you've ignored something important until it was too late. Maybe it was a person you overlooked. Or perhaps it's as simple as consuming a story without ever acknowledging the heart behind it. We all have a habit of talking until there's nothing left, don't we? Silas certainly did. He took Vespera's dignity, her safety, and her silence, never imagining she had a debt collector like the Vanes waiting in the wings. Killian Vane walked with a slow, rhythmic click of his polished boots against the stone. He stopped at the head of the long banquet table, picking up a silver goblet. He inspected it for a moment before letting it drop. The sound of it hitting the floor was like a gunshot. "A respectable family, Mrs. Pemberton," Killian said, his eyes finding the woman who had whispered behind the fern earlier. She let out a tiny, choked sob. "Isn't that what you called us?" "Difficulties, I believe was the word." I meant no offense, Your Grace," she stammered, using the old-world title the Vanes still carried from the days of the London Regency. "Offense is a luxury you cannot afford," Killian replied smoothly. He turned his attention back to Silas, who was currently being held in place by nothing more than the sheer weight of Malphas's predatory gaze. Malphas stepped into the center circle, his bone dagger tracing patterns in the air. "I've spent the last 3 years tracking our sister across the territories," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "I thought she was dead. I thought some scavenger had taken her. Imagine my surprise when I find she's been here, in this charming little hovel, being treated like a scullery maid." He stopped in front of Silas, the tip of his dagger resting just beneath the alpha's chin. "You felt powerful, didn't you? Shoving a woman who couldn't fight back?" Tell me, Alpha Silas, do you feel powerful now? She lied. Silas hissed, his voice cracking. She hid her scent. She claimed she was a stray. How did I know she was the youngest of the triad? Because a wolf of true character doesn't need a pedigree to show mercy, Dante growled from the shadows. He had shifted back to human form, though his chest was still bare and his eyes remained a feral, glowing gold. He walked toward Vespera, his expression softening only for her. He draped his own heavy coat over her shoulders, covering the torn dress and the belly Silas had tried to shame. Vespera leaned into her brother's warmth. He didn't just want me gone, Dante. He wanted to take the child. He wanted to exile me so he could marry the daughter of Alpha Thorn and consolidate the northern trade routes. Killian's eyes darkened. Trade routes. He traded my sister's life for a few miles of dirt and some shipping rights. He looked at the Silver Moon Council members, the elders who had sat by and nodded during Silas's decree. And you all agreed. You all watched as he broke the sacred bond of a mate. One of the elders, a man named Harlan, tried to stand. She has no mark. If she is his mate, why is she not marked? Vespera stepped forward, pulling the collar of her tunic down just enough to reveal her unmarked throat. He wouldn't mark me. He said I was too lowborn to carry the Silvermoon crest. He used me in the dark and ignored me in the light. The silence that followed was even more damning. Malphas let out a dark, dry chuckle. No mark. Well, that's a shame for you, Silas. Because if she were marked, her death would be a tragedy. Since she isn't, your death is just a necessity. Malphas raised his blade, the light of the dying hearth reflecting off the serrated edge. Silas scrambled backward, tripping over the hem of his own ceremonial robes, falling onto his backside in the middle of the hall. The great Alpha was reduced to a scurrying insect. Wait, Vespera said, her voice ringing out. Malphas paused, the blade inches from Silas's throat. He doesn't deserve a quick end, Vespera. You know our laws. I know the laws, Vespera said, walking toward the cowering Alpha. She looked down at him, her violet eyes cold and distant. But a quick death is a mercy. And Silas hasn't earned mercy yet. I want him to see his world crumble first. I want him to watch as every person who cheered for my exile bows to the Omega he despised. Killian smiled, a thin, razor-sharp expression. A long game. Truly, you are a vain. He turned to the room, his voice booming. Kneel. No one moved at first. I said. Killian's voice dropped into a low-frequency growl that made the stone floor vibrate. Kneel. One by one, the Silvermoon pack, warriors, elders, and ladies alike, dropped to their knees. The rustle of fabric and the thud of knees hitting stone was the sound of a kingdom falling. Silas was left sitting on the floor, the only one not kneeling, yet lower than all of them. This pack is now under the protection and the debt of the Vain Triad, Killian announced. And since our sister has been so poorly managed, we shall be staying to oversee the transition. As the pack members trembled in their submissive positions, Vespera felt a sudden, sharp pain in her abdomen. It wasn't a kick this time. It was a tightening, a cold sensation that made her breath hitch. She gripped Dante's arm, her knuckles turning white. Vespera? Dante asked, his eyes wide with sudden panic. She looked down. A dark stain was beginning to spread across the floor at her feet. Not blood, but the clear sign that the stress of the night had pushed her body too far. The baby, she whispered, her face going pale. Dante, the baby is coming. The brothers froze. The most dangerous men in the world were suddenly terrified, and in the corner of the room, Silas's eyes narrowed. He saw a final, desperate chance to regain control. Killian Vane, a man who could command an army of 10,000 without raising his pulse, looked at the widening pool at his sister's feet and felt his heart stop. It's funny how we think we're in control, isn't it? We plan, we plot, and we consume the stories of others, assuming we're safe behind the screen of our own lives. You watch Vespera suffer and you wait for the payoff. But the real world doesn't always wait for a convenient time to break. Sometimes, the most important moments happen when you're least prepared. Just like the support you might have forgotten to show. The small click of a like or a follow. It's the things we neglect that come back to haunt us when the stakes are highest. Clear the table, Killian roared, his voice stripping the skin off the air. The Silvermoon elites, who had been kneeling in terrified silence, scrambled backward as Dante lifted Vespera into his massive arms. He placed her on the long, dark oak banquet table, sweeping aside silver plates and half-eaten venison with a single, violent motion. "The child isn't due for another month," Malphas hissed, his bone dagger now put away, replaced by the trembling hands of a man who knew how to take life, but had no idea how to protect a beginning one. The stress, the humiliation. "Silas, you dog, you've killed them both." Silas, still on the floor, saw the shift in power. For a moment, the veins were distracted. Their focus was no longer on his execution, but on the girl bleeding on the oak. He saw his beta, Marcus, inching toward the shadows behind the pillars. A silent message passed between them. "Chaos is our only chance." "Art!" Vespera screamed, her back arching against the wood. The violet of her eyes was now swirling with a milky, primal light. Her wolf was pushing, trying to protect the pup from the hostile environment of the hall. "Killian, it's too soon. He's too small." "Stay with me, VS," Dante whispered, brushing her damp hair from her forehead. His voice, usually a weapon of war, was broken. "You're a vein. You're made of winter and iron. You don't break." "I need a healer," Killian shouted, turning to the kneeling pack. "Which of you specializes in birthing? Step forward now, or I will start taking heads until the right one emerges." A small, elderly woman with graying fur at her temples and a scent like dried herbs stood up with shaking knees. I am Martha, the pack's midwife. "But Alpha, the child is coming early. The equipment is in the infirmary and the hall is too cold. We need to move her." "She stays here," Malphas growled, sensing a trap. "We don't leave this hall. She will die here." Martha snapped, her fear of the brothers momentarily eclipsed by her duty. "Look at the floor. The stress has triggered a hemorrhage. If we don't get the bleeding under control, the Silvermoon pack won't just be under your debt. It will be your sister's graveyard." Vespera let out another cry, this one lower, more guttural. The ground beneath the hall groaned. Her power, untethered by her pain, was beginning to lash out at the architecture of the building. Cracks spiderwebbed across the obsidian pillars. "Killian," Vespera gasped, grabbing his lapel. "The child, don't let Silas, don't let him." Killian looked toward the corner where Silas had been sitting. The spot was empty. "Malphas. Dante. He's gone." The hall erupted. Silas's loyalists, seeing their alpha disappear into the secret passages behind the tapestries, drew their hidden blades. They knew that if the Vanes left the hall to save Vespera, they could be ambushed. If they stayed, they were sitting ducks. "Dante, stay with her and the midwife," Killian commanded, his violet eyes flashing with a lethal brilliance. "Malphas with me. We hunt the rat. No one leaves this house alive if my sister's breath falters." As the brothers split, one to guard the dying queen and two to hunt the coward, the torches in the hall suddenly flickered and went out, plunged into a supernatural darkness. From the shadows, the sound of a dozen bows being drawn echoed. Silas's voice drifted through the darkness, distorted and mocking. "You may be the kings of the North, Vanes, but this is Silvermoon, and in the dark, we know exactly where to strike." A silver-tipped arrow hissed through the air, aimed straight for Vespera's heart. It's easy to be brave when the lights are on, isn't it? To stand tall when everyone is watching and the path is clear. But it's the moments in the dark, the moments when you're alone with your fear, that define who you really are. We often walk through our lives like Silas's pack, following the loudest voice because it's safer than standing for what's right. You might be consuming this story right now, enjoying the thrill, but have you ever stopped to wonder if you'd be the one holding the arrow or the one shielding the light? We often forget that even a small gesture, a simple show of support like a like or a subscription, is a choice to stand with the Creator instead of lurking in the shadows. Dante didn't move from Vespera's side. He didn't have to. With a roar that shook the remaining glass from the chandeliers, he swung his massive arm, catching the silver-tipped arrow in his bare palm. The silver hissed against his skin, the smell of burning flesh filling the air, but he didn't flinch. He crushed the shaft to splinters. "Is that all you have, Silas?" Dante bellowed into the blackness. "Coward! Shooting at a woman in labor from the safety of the dark." "Dante!" Vespera's voice was a ragged whisper. She was sweating, her body convulsing as the midwife, Martha, worked by the dim light of a single glowing ember she had managed to save. "The baby, he's coming. I can't hold him back." "Then don't," Dante said, his voice dropping to a low, fierce rumble. He stood over her like a titan of old, his back to the darkness, his body a living shield. "Push, VS. I've got the world. You just bring him home." In the tunnels behind the walls, Killian and Malphas were a whirlwind of systematic destruction. They didn't need light. They moved by the vibrations of Silas's frantic heartbeat. "There," Malphas whispered, pointing his bone dagger toward a hidden lever disguised as a gargoyle's head. Killian didn't use the lever. He punched through the stone wall entirely, reaching in and dragging out a screaming guard by the throat. "Where is he?" I don't know. He went to the armory. He has the silver gas," the guard blurted before Killian tossed him aside. Killian's face went bone white. Silver gas. It was an ancient weapon, a fine powder of silver and wolfsbane that, when ignited, would suffocate any wolf within the hall. It wouldn't just kill the warriors. It would kill the midwife, the elders, and most certainly the newborn. Malphas, the ventilation shafts. Now, back in the hall, Vespera let out a scream that finally shattered the remaining obsidian pillars. The sound wasn't just pain, it was power. The blood howl was peaking, the violet light from her eyes illuminating the room in rhythmic pulses. With one final, agonizing heave, the tension in the room snapped. The wail of a newborn baby pierced the silence, sharp, clear, and demanding. The darkness seemed to recede. Martha the midwife held up a tiny, squirming bundle. "It's a boy," she whispered, her voice thick with awe. "He's small, but he's breathing. And his eyes. Alpha, look at his eyes." The infant's eyes weren't the gold of the Silvermoon pack. They were a brilliant, piercing violet. But there was no time for celebration. A hissing sound began to fill the hall, a pale, shimmering mist rolling in from the floor vents. The silver gas. "Dante, get her out of here." Killian's voice echoed from the rafters. He and Malphas dropped from the ceiling, their clothes torn and stained with the blood of Silas's guards. "The vents are rigged. Silas has sealed the exits." Silas's laughter rang out from the high balcony, where he stood behind a reinforced glass partition. He held a torch in his hand. "If I cannot have my pack, Vane, then no one will. You can die with your queen and her bastard in a cloud of silver dust." He dropped the torch. The gas hit the flame, but the explosion didn't happen. Vespera, still lying on the table, reached out a trembling hand toward the rising mist. The air around her began to swirl, a vacuum forming in the center of the hall. The silver gas didn't ignite. It began to spiral into a tight, glowing orb above her palm, held in place by the sheer, raw pressure of her Vane heritage. She looked up at Silas, her face a mask of cold, terrifying divinity. "You forgot one thing, Silas," she said, her voice sounding like 1,000 voices speaking at once. "I am not just a Vane. I am the daughter of the North. And the North never burns." With a flick of her wrist, she sent the orb of compressed silver gas flying straight at the balcony. It's easy to judge a person's soul when the sun is shining, but you only truly see someone when they hold the power of life and death in their hands. You've watched Vespera go from a servant to a goddess in the span of a night. We all love a transformation, don't we? But most people just watch the change without ever wanting to be part of the journey. They take the entertainment, the thrills, and the heart of the story, yet they walk away without leaving a single mark of support. Don't be the person who watches a kingdom rise in silence. If you believe Vespera's strength is worth more than Silas's cruelty, show it. Like the story, subscribe to her journey, and don't let her stand alone in this hall. Because a queen is only as strong as the people who choose to stand with her. Vespera stood up from the banquet table. Her movements were slow, burdened by the physical toll of the birth, but her gaze was unwavering. Dante moved to support her, but she waved him off. She took the small, violet-eyed bundle from Martha the midwife, tucking her son against her chest. "Killian, Malphas," she called out. The two brothers appeared at her side, their blades drawn, their faces splattered with the crimson of the men they had carved through to reach her. They looked at Silas, who was gasping on the balcony, his skin blistering from the silver dust. "Give the word, V.S.," Malphas whispered, his thumb tracing the edge of his bone dagger. "I'll make it last until the sun comes up. I'll peel his name from his bones." The Silvermoon pack members, still huddled in the corners, watched with bated breath. They expected a massacre. They expected the Vane triad to do what they were famous for, razing the pack to the ground and leaving nothing but salted earth and ghosts. Vespera looked at the faces of the pack. She saw Mrs. Pemberton shaking in fear. She saw the elders who had turned a blind eye. But she also saw the younger Omegas, the girls who had been her only friends in the kitchens, looking at her with a spark of hope they hadn't felt in years. If she let her brothers kill everyone, She wasn't a savior. She was just the next tyrant. Stop, Vespera commanded. He tried to kill your son, Vespera, Killian reminded her, his voice a low, dangerous warning. The Vane law is blood for blood. The Vane law is whatever I say it is tonight, she countered, her voice echoing with a newfound authority that made even Killian blink. She walked toward the center of the hall, her bare feet stepping over the debris of Silas's reign. She looked up at the balcony. Silas, stand up. The broken alpha crawled to the railing, clutching his throat. His face was a mask of agony and ruined pride. Finish it, then, he wheezed. You're a monster, just like them. No, Vespera said, her voice chillingly calm. A monster would kill you. A monster would give you the peace of the grave. I am going to give you something much worse. I am going to give you the truth. She turned to the pack. The Silvermoon Pack was founded on the ruins of old London to be a sanctuary. Silas turned it into a prison. He embezzled the trade funds, he broke the sacred mate bonds, and he tried to murder a newborn heir to hide his own cowardice. She looked back at Silas. I won't kill you. I strip you of your rank. I strip you of your name. You are no longer alpha. You are no longer even a wolf of this pack. She looked at Killian. I want him in the pit, the very exile he designed for me. Let him live in the shadows of the wastelands. Let him see if the rogues show him more mercy than he showed me. The pack erupted, not in protest, but in a hesitant, growing cheer. The weight of Silas's oppression was lifting. And the rest of them? Malphas asked, gesturing to the council. The ones who watched. Vespera's eyes swept over the elders. They will remain. They will rebuild. But they will do so under a new leadership. This pack no longer belongs to the Silvermoon lineage. She shifted the baby in her arms, looking at her brothers. It belongs to the Vanes now, and I will be the one to rule it. Killian's lips curled into a rare, genuine smile. He dropped to one knee, followed immediately by Malphas and Dante. Long live the matriarch of the North, they intoned in unison. But as the pack began to bow, a low, rhythmic thumping started outside the pack house. It wasn't the sound of brothers. It was the sound of iron boots. Hundreds of them. The Northern Trade Alliance. The army of Alpha Thorn, the man Silas had made his secret deal with, had arrived. And they weren't there to congratulate the new queen. There is a specific kind of terror that comes when you realize the war isn't over just because you won the first battle. You've seen Vespera claim her throne, you've seen her brothers kneel, and perhaps you think the story is reaching its comfortable end. We often do that. We consume the climax and then switch off, forgetting that the most dangerous moment is the one right after victory when your guard is down. If you've stayed with Vespera this long, don't turn away now. Like this chapter and subscribe to her reign, because a leader is only as strong as the loyalty of those who watch her back when the shadows return. Killian, the perimeter, Vespera commanded, her voice sounding like ice cracking on a lake. She didn't look like a woman who had just given birth. She looked like a goddess of war carved from the very obsidian of the hall. Killian was already at the window, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the treeline. Thorn brought the heavy infantry. 500 wolves, armed with silver-laced steel. He's not here for a wedding, Vespera. He's here to liquidate the Silvermoon assets. He's here for me, Silas croaked from the floor, a bloody grin splitting his scorched face. Thorn doesn't care about your lineage. He wants the territory. He'll kill every one of you. Dante didn't even look at Silas. He simply kicked him back into the shadows. Let him come. I haven't had a real fight since the Great Thaw. No, Vespera said, handing the baby back to the midwife. Dante, you and Malphas stay here. Protect the pups and the elders. Killian with me. Vespera, you can barely stand, Killian protested, his protective instincts warring with the sudden, fierce respect he felt for his sister. I am a Vane, she whispered, her violet eyes beginning to glow with a terrifying, rhythmic pulse. And this is my pack. If I don't face him, they will never believe I can lead them. The massive front doors, already hanging by their hinges, were kicked aside. Alpha Thorn stepped into the hall. He was a man of pure muscle and scars, draped in the pelt of a polar bear. Behind him stood a wall of warriors, their silver spears gleaming in the torchlight. Where is Silas? Thorn roared, his voice shaking the remaining shards of the chandeliers. I was told there was a stray to be disposed of and a contract to be signed. Vespera stepped forward, walking through the center of the hall. The Silvermoon wolves parted for her like the Red Sea. She stood alone against the wall of spears, the light of the moon catching the dried blood on her dress. Silas is no longer alpha, she said, her voice small but carrying a weight that made Thorn's lead warriors shift their feet. I am Vespera Vane, and you are trespassing. Thorn laughed, a sound like grinding gravel. A Vane? The little runaway? I heard stories of a third sibling, a weakling who fled the north because she couldn't handle the smell of iron. You're the one Silas was going to toss into the wastelands. He raised a heavy, silver-weighted mace. Move aside, girl. I'm taking this pack house, and I'm taking Silas's head for failing to deliver my bride. You won't take a single stone, Vespera replied. She closed her eyes, reaching deep into the earth beneath the hall. She felt the ancient foundations, the old London iron buried deep in the soil from centuries ago. She didn't shift into a wolf. She shifted the very air around her. As Thorn lunged forward, his mace swinging in a deadly arc, Vespera didn't flinch. She tapped into the blood howl. But instead of a scream, she released a focused pulse of kinetic energy. The silver spears in the hands of Thorn's men suddenly vibrated, turning white-hot. Men screamed, dropping their weapons as the silver burned through their leather gloves. Thorn's mace was wrenched from his hands by an invisible force, pinning him against the obsidian pillar. Vespera walked up to him, her face inches from his. The air was humming with the scent of ozone and ancient power. You think I'm weak because I chose peace? She whispered. I chose peace because I knew exactly how easy it would be to destroy men like you. She placed a hand on his chest. A spark of violet light jumped from her fingers. Thorn's eyes went wide as his heart skipped a beat, then another. Go back to the north, Vespera commanded. Tell them the Silvermoon Pack is under the protection of the Vane matriarch. If I see your banners on my land again, I won't just burn your spears. I'll burn your legacy. She released him. Thorn fell to his knees, gasping for air, his bravado shattered. He looked at the woman before him, a mother, a queen, and a monster all in one, and he saw the death of his own ambition. Withdraw, Thorn choked out. As the invaders retreated into the night, Vespera stood in the doorway, watching them go. But as the adrenaline began to fade, her legs gave way. Killian caught her before she hit the ground. "V.S. I'm fine," she wheezed, looking back into the hall at her people. They were no longer looking at her with fear. They were looking at her with a devotion that bordered on worship. But in the back of the hall, near the secret passages, a shadow moved. Silas hadn't been watching the battle. He had been watching the midwife. And the midwife was gone. It's easy to feel satisfied now, isn't it? To see the villain run and the hero stand tall. But while you were watching the flashy display of power, did you notice the silence in the corner? Did you notice the one thing that actually mattered? We get so distracted by the spectacle, by the likes and the drama, that we forget to protect the very heart of why we're here. Most of you will finish this chapter and move on, never realizing that the storyteller, much like Vespera, gives everything to keep you entertained. Don't be like the Silvermoon guards who looked away at the wrong moment. If you found value in this journey, don't let it end in silence. Subscribe, support, and show that you know how to protect what is precious before it's gone. The baby, Vespera gasped, her hands clawing at Killian's tunic. Killian, where is Martha? The brothers' heads snapped toward the stone dais where the midwife had been standing. The area was empty. A single, small knitted blanket lay on the floor, discarded and cold. A low, guttural laugh echoed from the deep throat of the service tunnels. I told you, Vespera. Silas's voice was a ragged shadow of its former self, coming from the darkness of the pit entrance. If I cannot be Alpha, I will be the ghost that haunts your every waking breath. Dante was a blur of motion, diving into the tunnel, but a heavy iron grate slammed shut with a boom that shook the hall. Through the bars, the dim light revealed Silas. He was covered in silver burns, his skin sloughing off in patches, but he held the violet-eyed infant in his arms like a shield. One step closer, Berserker, Silas hissed, pressing a jagged shard of glass against the baby's swaddling, and the vein line ends tonight. Vespera pushed herself off Killian, her legs shaking so violently she had to lean against an obsidian pillar for support. Silas, let him go. This is between us. You've lost. Don't add child killer to your legacy. Legacy? Silas spat, a crazed light in his eyes. You took my pack. You took my honor. I am already a dead man. But a dead man can still take what you love most. He began to back away into the labyrinth of the old London sewers that sat beneath the pack house. A maze of freezing water and ancient stone where scents were lost in the damp. Malfa's the secondary vent, Killian commanded, his mind working at 1,000 miles an hour. Dante, stay on the grate. Vespera. I'm going after him, she said. You can't, Killian caught her arm. You're hemorrhaging VS. You'll bleed out before you reach the first junction. Vespera looked at her brother, and for the first time in his life, the eldest Vane felt a flicker of genuine fear. Her eyes weren't just violet anymore. They were a void, a bottomless pit of maternal rage that transcended the power of any alpha. Then I will die in the dark, she whispered. But I will not let him touch my son. She didn't wait for permission. Tapping into the last reserves of her Vane blood, she shifted, not into a wolf, but into something more primal. Her body elongated, her shadows stretching across the floor like living ink. She slipped through the bars of the grate as if she were made of smoke, her form re-solidifying on the other side. The tunnels were a nightmare of echoing drips and the smell of rot. She followed the sound of her baby's heartbeat, a tiny rhythmic thumping that sounded like a war drum in her ears. She found him at the edge of the Black Sump, a deep, underwater cavern where the city's ancient runoff met the subterranean river. Silas was standing on a slick stone ledge, holding the baby over the dark, churning water. One more step and he swims, Silas warned. Vespera stopped. She stood in the center of the tunnel, the water swirling around her ankles. She didn't growl. She didn't threaten. She simply reached out her hand. Silas, she said softly, her voice echoing with a strange, hypnotic resonance. You wanted to be a great alpha. You wanted power. Look at you. You're holding a child because you're too weak to face a woman. I am the alpha of Silvermoon, he screamed. No, Vespera said, her voice dropping to a terrifying chill. You are the man who forgot that the North doesn't just produce alphas. It produces monsters. She didn't lunge. She didn't shout. She simply whispered a single word in the old tongue of the Vane ancestors. The water in the sump didn't splash. It rose. A massive, frozen hand of ice and river silt erupted from the dark, grabbing Silas by the waist. The glass shard flew from his hand as the ice crushed his ribs. Vespera leapt. She caught the baby in midair as Silas was dragged down into the freezing depths of the sump. She landed on the ledge, her son tucked tightly against her chest, his violet eyes wide and silent as they looked up at her. She didn't look back as the water closed over Silas's head. When she emerged from the tunnels back into the grand obsidian hall, her brothers were waiting. The pack was waiting. She was covered in mud, blood, and the filth of the sewers, but as she walked toward the throne Silas had once occupied, every single wolf dropped to their knees without being told. She sat on the cold stone, her son in her lap. Killian placed the alpha's signet ring on her finger. The pack is yours, Vespera, he said. No, she said, looking out at the faces of the people who had once mocked her. The pack is ours, and the world is going to find out what happens when you try to break a Vane. It is a rare thing to witness the birth of an era. Most people spend their lives looking backward, mourning the things they lost or the people who failed them. You've watched Vespera rise from the literal dirt of this hall to sit upon a throne forged in the fires of her own resilience. It's been a long journey, hasn't it? Many started this story with you, but they dropped off, losing interest when things got difficult or when the fun was over. But you stayed. You saw her through the dark. If you believe that stories like this, stories of the silent finally finding their voice, deserve to be told, then don't let this be our last meeting. Like, subscribe, and join the pack. Because while this chapter ends, Vespera's reign is only just beginning, and you wouldn't want to miss what she does next. 6 months had passed since the night of the equinox. The Silvermoon packhouse had been transformed. The dark tapestries were gone, replaced by the vibrant furs and banners of the Northern Territories. The pit had been sealed with iron and stone, buried forever beneath the foundations of a new infirmary. Vespera sat in a chair by the high window of the solar, the morning sun warming her face. She was dressed in simple, elegant leather and wool, her long auburn hair braided with silver wire. In her arms, the young heir, named Lucian, gurgled, his violet eyes tracking the movement of a small, carved wooden wolf that Killian had brought from the north. He has your temperament, Killian remarked, leaning against the doorframe. He looked less like a warlord and more like a proud uncle, though the twin blades at his hips reminded everyone that the Vane triad was never truly soft. God help us if he has yours, Vespera teased, her voice light and full of a peace she hadn't known for years. The pack was thriving. Under Vespera's rule, The rigid caste system of elites and omegas had been dismantled. Rank was now earned through merit and character, not birthright. The kitchens were no longer a place of shame. They were the heart of a home. Malphas and Dante had remained as well, serving as the pack's protectors. Malphas had taken it upon himself to train a new generation of guardians, teaching them that strength without mercy was merely thuggery. Dante, surprisingly, had become the favorite of the pack's children, often seen in the courtyard with 5 or 6 pups hanging off his massive arms. "There is a delegation from the Southern Alliance at the gates," Killian said, his expression turning serious. "They heard rumors that the Vane Triad has gone soft in their old age. They want to discuss the new border taxes." Vespera stood up, handed Lucian to the midwife, who was now the head of the medical council, and straightened her tunic. She felt the power humming beneath her skin, a steady, controlled flame that no longer needed to scream to be heard. "Let them in," Vespera said, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips. "I think it's time they realize that the Silvermoon Pack isn't just a sanctuary anymore. It's the capital of a new North." As she walked toward the grand hall, her brothers fell in step behind her. They weren't there to lead. They were there to support. The girl who had once hidden behind a pillar was gone. In her place was a matriarch who had survived the worst of men and the coldest of winters. She reached the heavy doors of the hall and paused, looking at the carved crest above the archway. It was no longer just a moon. It was a moon encircled by 3 ravens, the Vane mark. Vespera pushed the doors open. The hall was full of her people. When they saw her, they didn't kneel in fear. They stood in respect. She took her seat, her violet eyes scanning the newcomers who waited nervously at the far end of the room. She thought of Silas, somewhere in the frozen wastes, a man who had traded his soul for a throne he couldn't keep. And then she thought of her son, sleeping safely in the room above. "Welcome to Silvermoon," Vespera announced, her voice echoing with the authority of a queen and the heart of a mother. "State your business, and choose your words carefully. You are in the presence of the Vanes." The story of the Omega Stray was over. The legend of the Vane Queen had begun.